I want to get to this here really quickly. Cops, lawyers, the police officers involved in the George Floyd case, the lawyers for these police officers, we've been sort of following this story every stream, and the lawyers for these police officers have made bombshell claims in the George Floyd case. They say that, quote, the body camera shows Floyd ingesting a fatal amount of drugs before the arrest. He died of overdose. So they're saying that the body camera footage shows Floyd ingesting the drugs as the police showed up. Defense attorney Eric J. Nelson, lawyer for former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin, said that the late George Floyd was the victim of a careless overdose rather than police homicide. Authorities charged Chauvin with murder in connection with Floyd's May death, which stemmed from an altercation purportedly involving counterfeit money. In light of the allegations, Nelson is requesting a judge to drop all charges against Chauvin, who has pleaded not guilty. An attorney for one of the other officers involved in Floyd's death also says body camera footage shows the moment Floyd reportedly ingested a lethal amount of drugs. So what have I been saying for the longest time? What I've been saying is that it's probably more likely that George Floyd died from a drug overdose, and many people have been saying this, than it is that he died from the knee on his neck, right? And it's also more likely that he ingested the methamphetamines and the fentanyl as he saw the police show up, because this is what we see people do all the time, is that they swallow the drugs, they try to hide the drugs as police show up so that police do not catch them with those drugs. And he had, above the lethal dose of fentanyl in his system, 11 nanograms per milliliter. The average is 9 nanograms per milliliter as far as what we find in the victims of fentanyl overdose in their systems. And so this is what the police are arguing. And so when these police get off, because they're not going to get, Chauvin is not going to get murder too, I'm almost certain of that. When these police get off, we are probably going to see riots beyond what we have seen. And this is the reason why I say that they are not going to be able to stop this. No matter how many times they come out and condemn the violence, no matter how many times they come out and send Joe Biden out there with an earpiece to regurgitate talking points from the Democratic Party condemning the violence, no matter how hard they come down on the violent rioters and protesters out there right now, they are not going to be able to stop this. This has gotten way out of hand for these people, and these riots are only going to continue and probably continue to get worse all the way leading up to the election, which is inevitably only going to aid Trump and the Republican Party and increase this racial consciousness among white Americans that we talked about during this stream. According to a Monday report from ABC News, Nelson filed a motion in Hennepin County, Minnesota District Court on Friday, alleging that the prosecution has not shown probable cause in charging Chauvin with second-degree unintentional murder, third-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter. In the motion, Chauvin's attorneys insist the former police officer carried out Floyd's detainment by the book, including the use of a maximal restraint technique, and that's the kneeling on the neck of George Floyd, which we see all the time police do. Nelson said Chauvin believed the technique was necessary out of concern that Floyd could harm himself or Chauvin and his fellow officers during the detainment, and they have probable cause to believe this, considering what we saw from the body camera footage that they tried to hide, which is that he was resisting arrest the entire time. He dove out of the vehicle. He begged for police to bring him to the ground. We've been over this. We don't have to keep going over this. Nelson has said that Chauvin and other responding officers were trying to help Floyd, who was clearly acting erratically during the detainment out of concern for the man and the possibility that he might fall and strike his head, be hit by an oncoming vehicle in the road, and more. Nelson insisted that the Minneapolis Police Department has approved training materials on such use of force, which shows an officer placing a knee on a subject's neck in order to subdue him. So this is something also I've been saying since the beginning, is that this is a standard technique that police officers use and train other officers to use, which is kneeling on the back or kneeling on the neck of an assailant in order to completely subdue him. Now, this guy's over 6 feet. He's over 200 pounds, well over 200 pounds, and he was able to easily throw these police officers around as they were attempting to detain him and put him into the vehicle. The motion also noted that the autopsy on Floyd concluded that there was both fentanyl and methamphetamine in the late suspect's system, otherwise known as a speedball. Floyd, who suffered from hypertensive heart disease as well as arteriosclerosis and hypertension, also reportedly was positive for COVID-19 at the time of his death. He had, I think, 2 of his major arteries, from what I read, were like 90% clogged. 90% clogged as far as his, like, 2 main arteries. He had heart disease, he had all sorts of underlying conditions. He also had COVID-19. So if, under any other circumstances, we saw that report that came out that said that under any other circumstances, George Floyd would have been ruled, his death would have been ruled a fentanyl overdose. But would it really, in 2020, would it really be concluded a fentanyl overdose, or would it be concluded a COVID-19 death? So he had heart disease, he had arteriosclerosis, or however the fuck you pronounce that, which just means sclerosis of the arteries, hypertension. He had, all sorts of other underlying conditions. He took a lethal dose of fentanyl, but he had COVID-19. So it's probably more likely the case that his death would have been ruled a death of COVID-19 if not for the police intervention. Put simply, Mr. Floyd could not breathe because he had ingested a lethal dose of fentanyl and possibly a speedball, a portion of the motion read. Combined with sickle cell trait, his pre-existing heart conditions, Mr. Floyd's use of fentanyl and methamphetamine most likely killed him. Adding fentanyl and methamphetamine to Mr. Floyd's existing health issues was tantamount to lighting a fuse to a bomb. Now, you have to remember the body camera footage showed that George Floyd could not breathe. He said he couldn't breathe multiple times before police took him to the ground. And they also said that he was foaming at the mouth as well. Now, on COVID-19, last story here, I believe. Yeah, last story for today before we get to the calls and all of these super chats. We had this report from the CDC that came out recently. Damn it, Vince, you said 2 p.m. I know, I'm sorry. We started at 12. I started at 12. I wanted to get this done a little bit earlier. I'm not exactly sure yet now. I keep going back and forth on what the time is going to be for the daily streams. I said 2 p.m. Pacific time. I started streaming at 12 p.m. Pacific time today or around there. But probably it's going to be 2 p.m., but it could possibly be 12 p.m. I'll make an announcement on my Telegram channel. Just wait for that announcement to come out, and that will be, and then once that's determined, it'll be final. So the CDC came out and they said that 94% of COVID-19 deaths had underlying medical conditions. And this is really not a surprise as far as like the underlying medical conditions are concerned. But it's only when you couple it with what Dr. Burke said a little while ago, which is that the mortality rates and case numbers could potentially be inflated by up to 25%. And some of these other errors that we're seeing coming out of like Texas and Florida, some of the errors coming from the labs out of Texas, Florida, and other states across the country. And then what we're seeing from anecdotal stories, which is that people are saying that, their mother or their father or their grandmother or their friend or their uncle or something like this, their death is being registered as a COVID-19 death, even though they know that they died from a stroke, or even though they know that they died from a heart attack or something like this, right? But because they tested positive for COVID-19 at the time of their death, this death is automatically registered as a COVID-19 death. And so this is what we're talking about with George Floyd. So with George Floyd, he had COVID-19, right? He also had fentanyl and methamphetamine in his system. He also had a bunch of heart conditions. He also had, sickle cell disease, and he also had all of these other things. But, if we just take the police out of the equation, and if he just died on the street or something like this, it wouldn't have been ruled an overdose. 6 months ago, it would have, according to the medical examiner, that under any other circumstances, this would have been ruled a fentanyl overdose. But today, in August of 2020, his death probably would have been ruled a COVID-19 death. And so this is what this report goes on to say. that the Centers for Disease Control released information showing how many people who died from COVID-19 had comorbidities or underlying conditions, as they are sometimes referred to by doctors. According to the CDC, comorbidity is defined as more than one disease or condition that is present in the same person at the same time. Conditions described as comorbidities are often chronic or long-term conditions. Other names to describe comorbid conditions are coexisting or co-occurring conditions, and sometimes also multi-morbidity or multiple chronic conditions. Comorbidity and underlying conditions can both be used to describe conditions that exist in one person at the same time. These also can contribute to a person's death who has been diagnosed with COVID-19. So that part is very important there. And it says, quote, Table 3 shows the types of health conditions and contributing causes mentioned in conjunction with deaths involving coronavirus disease 2019, COVID-19. For 6% of the deaths, COVID-19 was the only cause mentioned. So only 6% of the deaths, COVID-19 was the only cause mentioned. For deaths with conditions or causes in addition to COVID-19, on average, there were 2.6 additional conditions or causes per death. The CDC says people need to always social distance and perform best practices when it comes to staying safe during the COVID-19 pandemic. So here are the top underlying medical conditions linked with COVID-19 deaths. Now, you have to remember, 94% of the deaths: influenza and pneumonia, respiratory failure, hypertensive disease, diabetes, vascular and unspecified dementia, cardiac arrest, heart failure, renal failure, meaning like kidney failure, intentional and unintentional injury, poisoning and other adverse events. What? Poisoning and other adverse events are listed with COVID-19 deaths. Other medical conditions. What the fuck does that mean? So if we look at the graphs here, we see we go to the charts, we go to the tables, and it shows that basically the majority of the deaths, 80+% of the deaths that are listed as COVID-19 deaths, are above the age of 55 years old. And the most common comorbidity that we see are things like cancer, heart disease, and asthma. I think were like the top three as far as the tables that when you dig into the CDC report that you see. But then they also include all of these other like very broad ways of describing comorbidities, like this one here: intentional and unintentional injury, poisoning, and other adverse events. According to the CDC, 9,683 died in the United States with only having COVID-19 listed on their death certificate. So this really makes sense as we look at this article here from Business Insider, where Dr. Deborah Birx said there's nothing from the CDC that I can trust, where she goes on to say that the coronavirus statistics like mortality rates and case numbers could be inflated by up to 25%. By up to 25%. Very strange. Very strange.